Hello, my name is Jim Potts and I work for Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. I'm doing a presentation today on Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, Dislocated Worker Eligibility. For WIOA Dislocated Worker Eligibility, there's a lot of various federal and state guidance that's directed towards this program. We have the first overall Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act legislation itself, and that came out in 2014. It was effective July 1st, 2015. And then also from Department of Labor, they put out Training and Employment Guidance Letter 1916, which is guidance on the adult and dislocated worker. And this came out in March of 2017. Those were that is the last guidance that has came out from Department of Labor on the dislocated worker program. We also have, within commerce policies, we have general eligibility, which is Chapter 5, and then we have selective service, which is Chapter 5.1.1 through 5.114, and then we also have the WIOA dislocated worker eligibility policy itself, Chapter 5, Section 3. You'll also notice on the bottom of this screen, or this slide, is a URL to the Apprenticeship Resources page. This is a really handy resource for everything associated with the apprenticeship program. And on there, you'll notice on the left side, there's a section on eligibility documents. And it includes all the various federal and state policies and guidance, including those that are referenced here, but also those for all the other WIOA programs. Prior to reviewing this presentation on dislocated worker, it is important that you view and understand the details that were covered in the previous presentation on WIOA general eligibility. If you have not viewed the presentation on WIOA general eligibility, it's very important that you go and view that prior to this presentation on dislocated worker, because it's going to cover the details of things like authorized to work in the United States, compliance with selective service, and veterans priority of service. We won't be covering those in depth in this presentation. So again, it's important to go back and review that WIOA general eligibility if you have not done so prior to watching this presentation. Now for WIOA dislocated worker eligibility, there are 5 different ways a client could be determined eligible under dislocated worker. There are unlikely return to previous industry occupation, plant closure or substantial layoff, formerly self-employed, now unemployed, displaced homemaker, and spouse of a member of the armed forces on active duty. Now, the information on most of the dislocated worker eligibility criteria is indicated on the goals and current situation screen, and it's under the employment-related questions. And under that, you'll see, and here's a sampling of all the various questions, and we're going to go in depth on each one of those that are affecting dislocated worker eligibility. Something that's also important to understand, you'll notice the term underemployed is included as part of the various WIOA dislocated worker eligibility criteria. It comes up a lot for the displaced homemaker as well as spouse of active duty service member. Under WIOA, underemployed is defined as an individual who is working part-time but desires full-time employment, or an individual who is working in employment that's not commensurate with the individual's demonstrated level of educational attainment. So on this, the first one's self-explanatory. Somebody's working part-time but wants to work full. The second would be somebody who maybe has a master's or a bachelor's degree and it's not working in that field. Maybe they're working in a job that's below their educational level. So that's one portion of underemployed, but within TEGL 1916, which is the additional guidance that was provided by Department of Labor on adult dislocated worker, they expanded underemployed even more so, and they spoke about anybody who is working full-time but is on public assistance, so food stamps, cash welfare, medical, those types of public assistance. They should also be considered underemployed. Additionally, TEGL 1916 also stated anybody who meets any WIOA low-income criteria but are working full-time could be considered underemployed. And also individuals who are employed but whose current job earnings are not sufficient compared to previous job earnings from a previous employment. So I'll describe this a little bit more. Local workforce innovation areas often define self-sufficiency criteria for the dislocated worker based on a percentage of a layoff wage from a previous employment. So in this example, let's say we have an individual who was laid off from a job making $50,000 a year. And if a local's policy states that in order for a person to be self-sufficient, they must make at least 80% of the dislocation wage. So in this example, if somebody had a job that was making below $40,000 for their new job, that would be less than the 80% of the previous wage. So that job making less than $40,000 in this example could be considered underemployed. If the person in this example had a job making $40,000 or more, that would be at or exceed 80% of the dislocation wage. So then that would be the self-sufficient employment. So that's just a little bit of a understanding of this barrier of individuals who are employed but whose current job earnings are not sufficient compared to those previous earnings. Now let's talk more in depth about each of these 5 different ways somebody could meet dislocated worker eligibility. We'll first touch on unlikely return to previous industry or occupation. Out of those 5 different ways an individual could be determined eligible under dislocated worker, by far the most complex criteria is for unlikely to return to previous industry or occupation. We'll just call it unlikely to return for this presentation. For unlikely return, it's very layered, meaning that there are several factors that will determine if an individual meets this criteria. The next several slides will cover this very layered criteria. First, to meet the criteria of unlikely return, an individual who worked at a job that paid into unemployment insurance on behalf of the client, the individual is required to be eligible to draw a monetary UI benefit or has exhausted the UI benefit. This is very important to understand. So if a person worked at a job, had paid into UI on his or her behalf, they must be eligible to draw a UI benefit or exhaust it. Now where this is addressed for the application, it's on the goals and current situation screen under employment-related questions. If the question, I am eligible, receiving, or exhausted unemployment benefits is marked, then it will bring up 3 other questions. I am unemployed and receiving UI benefits. I am eligible but not receiving UI benefits. I have exhausted my UI benefits. So any 3 of those secondary questions that are checked would meet that criteria that I spoke about of an individual who worked at a job, who had paid into unemployment, and that they are eligible to draw or exhausted their UI benefits. Some additional details about unemployment insurance. Traditional UI payments are received when an individual loses their job where the employer of record had been paying into the UI system on behalf of the individual. When the individual applies for UI, as long as the employer does not dispute the UI claim, the individual is able to draw the UI benefits while looking for the new employment. In recent past, there's been a lot of information about the different UI payments called Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, PUA program, which provides benefits for many individuals who have been determined ineligible for traditional unemployment benefits. What I'm speaking about here is when a person had worked at a job that did not, where the employer had not paid into unemployment on their behalf. Some really good examples are somebody who is self-employed or an independent contractor are probably 2 of the most well-known groups of individuals who receive PUA. Regardless if the individual receives or has received traditional UI benefits or the PUA benefits, or receiving or eligible to receive monetary benefits but are not currently drawing, or have exhausted either traditional UI or PUA, they would meet this portion of the eligibility criteria under unlikely to return. Now again, from the demonstration under the employment-related questions, in this example, I'm checking I am unemployed and receiving UI benefits. So when that comes up during eligibility determination, you'll notice below are the various documentation choices that could be used to support a check for unemployed and receiving benefits. It's the same documentation choices for eligible but not receiving UI benefits or exhausted. On this, you'll notice most reference IDES UI, so that's Illinois Department of Employment Security. One of the things that's important to know is if somebody is drawing unemployment benefits from another state, it works the exact same way that you could check and you'll see the choice of other states' UI records showing eligible for benefits. One thing I want to cover is called the alternative to UI. Within the WIOA dislocated worker eligibility, there's an alternative criteria to UI, which is called tenure. Tenure is for individuals who worked at a job or in an industry for at least 6 months where the employer did not pay into the UI system on behalf of the employee. A point to understand on this is in the current situation, the majority of individuals who typically would have met the tenure alternative to UI are eligible or were eligible to draw the pandemic unemployment assistance. However, if a client was dislocated from a job where they had worked at least 6 months and the employer had not paid into UI system on their behalf and they were not eligible for PUA, that is when the alternative criteria of tenure should be indicated. When this tenure is indicated, like UI, it is a portion of the eligibility criteria under unlikely to return criteria. Documentation for tenure. For the question of tenure, which is part of the criteria for dislocated worker unlikely to return, the acceptable documentation would be the client's work history, which would basically need to support that they worked at a job that had not paid into UI and the client was not eligible for the pandemic unemployment assistance. So what you're looking at there is the client had to, again, work at least 6 months at a job that did not pay into unemployment on his or her behalf, and then they were not also eligible for pandemic unemployment insurance. Currently, the question related to tenure is not in the application. It will be updated as part of the next round of system changes. But again, almost all clients who would have met tenure should have received the PUA benefit. It is very important to understand that under the criteria of unlikely return, if an individual is laid off or fired or quit, etc., from a job where the employer had paid into UI system on behalf of the individual, and the individual is or has been denied UI benefits, the individual cannot be determined eligible under the dislocated worker criteria of unlikely return. There is no exception to this paragraph above. Often people will try to mix and match the tenure, but the tenure is for people who did not pay into unemployment. So it's really important to understand if an individual worked at a job where the employer had paid into unemployment on his or her behalf and they're denied UI benefits, they are not going to be eligible as a dislocated worker under unlikely to return, and more than likely will not meet other dislocated worker criteria. So you'd be looking at the adult title for their eligibility. Speak about a dislocation job. For a client to meet eligibility criteria under the dislocated worker title of unlikely return, if they meet the UI criteria or the alternative to UI criteria called tenure, then the job that the individual is attempting to have their eligibility determined on would be the client's dislocation job. This dislocation job should be the most recent full-time self-sustained employment that the client had. The next few slides are going to demonstrate recording a dislocation job. It's within the apprenticeship application under work history is where the employment history is recorded. In the application under work history, there's an add employment button. So when that is clicked, you have the information on enter new employment. Well, what this is really asking, are you currently employed by this employer? No. So this would be, again, your dislocation job, and it should be the most recent self-sustaining employment, the last job the person had just lost. And in there, you put the employer name, start date, end name, job title, the street address, employer. Here's a demonstration of one that has been completed for an individual mock record that I've created. So when determining eligibility under the dislocation job, it will require additional information about the job, including the NAICS code, which is dealing with a declining industry, or the ONET/SOC code, which deals with the occupation the person was from. Was it in a low growth occupation? And then the layoff reason. If you attempt to move forward during eligibility without populating the NAICS code, the ONET code, the SOC, the layoff reason, the following error message comes up: the field is required. So you have to populate this for this dislocation job. So under the dislocated worker criteria of unlikely return, other considerations needed besides the UI status was from the client's dislocation job. Was that dislocation job from a declining industry as defined by the North American Industrial Classification System, the NAICS code category, with less than the statewide average growth rates? And or was the person's dislocation job from a low growth occupation defined as any ONET codes category with an average annual employment growth rate less than the statewide average growth rate for all occupations? What this is talking about is if a person loses his or her job and they're not from a declining industry and not from a low growth occupation, what would then not stop them from being able to go get another job, since these are not declining or low growth? One of the things that's probably really important to understand that probably 90%, or if not higher than, if not higher, of the jobs out there, they're going to fall under either declining industry or a low growth occupation. For the NAICS, how it works is you click on Add NAICS at the blue hyperlink there, and then it's going to bring up the screen that's shown on the right, and then it's got a search button. I encourage you to use a keyword search, because if you just search, it's going to look through all NAICS. It's going to take a long time, so you should use a keyword search. So here's an example. That person, I don't know if you recall, but worked at PNC Bank. So I put in just the word bank, and when I hit search, it brought up a number of choices. So then I clicked on commercial banking, and it gives me the choices of NAICS codes. Now you'll notice there were two choices. There's a 6-digit NAICS codes and a 5-digit. Right now, we should be using our 6-digit NAICS code. So that's the one you'd want to select. There are some programming changes that should be taking away those 5 and fewer NAICS codes. So hopefully when you're working this, you'll just see the 6. But if there are 6 or fewer characters, make sure to choose the one that has the 6 characters for the NAICS code. So in this case, we have picked the NAICS code for it, and now we're going to demonstrate picking the ONET or SOC code. Very simply, you click on the hyperlink, you put in the search, and I encourage you to put in the job that the person's using. So when we use this keyword, it brings up our choices. In this case, the correct one would be the tellers, so the 433071. So that one's chosen, and then it's attached to the record. The next is recording the specific layoff reason that the client lost his or her job. So you have flood, natural disaster, general economic conditions, in process of going out of business, lack of work, plant closure, substantial layoff. Whichever is correct for the client is what should be selected. Now, it's still important to understand that any individual attempting to be qualified under unlikely return must be eligible to draw the monetary UI benefits, or has exhausted their UI, or meets the tenure. But if the dislocation job is not from a low growth industry or declining occupation, the person could not be determined as unlikely to return. However, there are a couple other ways that come into play, and those are also captured on the goals and current situation screen under the employment related section. You'll notice towards the bottom, there's 2 questions. I have been unemployed for 27 weeks and required additional assistance to regain employment. So the question for unemployed 27 weeks, that is for somebody who is considered long-term unemployed. So if that is checked, if the client's dislocation job was not from a declining industry or a low growth occupation, and then if you check that 27 weeks, the criteria within our policy states that if a person's been unemployed 26 weeks and they have 1 month of job search through Illinois WorkNet or through the IBIZ section through the IDS system, then you would be able to make the client unlikely to return. Again, if the client is already low growth or declining industry from their dislocation job, you wouldn't need to deal with this portion of criteria, but it'd be used if a client had a dislocation job that was not from a declining industry or a low growth occupation. When you check that question of 27 weeks, what happens then, it opens up another question, and I have 1 month of job search pops up. So both of those questions would need to be checked in order for this criteria to be met. And then when those questions are checked, I've been unemployed 27 weeks and I have 1 month of job search, then it brings up the criteria for unlikely to return. So you'd have the documentation choices that show up on the left. And one of the key things that's important to understand about this is you're actually qualifying for two different things. You're needing to make sure to show unemployed at least 26 weeks, which is 6 months, and 1 month of job search. So you'd be expected to have documentation to support both of those if those questions are checked. Lastly, if a client whose dislocation job was not from a declining industry, nor was the dislocation job from a low growth occupation, nor was the client considered long-term unemployed based on the 27 weeks with 1 month of job search. There's another question about requires additional assistance. It's really important to understand the details about this. For the required additional assistance, it's only needed, again, if the dislocation job was not from a declining industry or low growth, or if the person did not meet long-term unemployed criteria. When you check, or when the client checks the required additional assistance question, it's really stating that after an assessment of education skills or work experiences have been determined by the Title I-B entity, which is the WIOA grantee, or in this case, the apprenticeship grantee, required to additional assistance to qualify for any available openings in the industry or occupation from which this person was laid off, or to obtain employment in another occupation. Such determination must be documented in the person's case file. What this is speaking about is if the person is dislocated from a job that's not a declining industry or not a low growth occupation, and they haven't been long-term unemployed, why couldn't they go back to that previous job? Well, there's circumstances. Let's think about when it could come up. If required additional assistance, let's say I am a truck driver and I've had a medical or legal reason I could not go back to that job. So then the job is not low growth or declining, but myself, I could justify it of why that person could not go back. So the big thing to understand about required additional assistance, it should be used if a client is at a job where it's not declining, not low growth, where they cannot go back due to some circumstances. So here's some examples. The one I just spoke about, where requires additional assistance might come into play, is when an individual has a medical or legal reason they can no longer do work, such as a CDL truck driver who has a medical or legal reason that prevents them from driving. Another example could be an individual who lost their job that is in a high demand, but the current skill set is not up to date with the current job. Example could be a computer programmer who doesn't have the latest certifications. So these are just a couple of examples. There could be a number of different reasons why somebody loses their job that's not from a declining industry or low growth, why they cannot go back to it. But the important thing to understand is if you check that question, or if the client checks that question, the career planner or the grantee staff must be able to justify why the person cannot go back to that previous type of work. So again, it's important to understand this alternative criteria is related to the question of required additional assistance to regain employment. It would only be needed if the client's dislocation of job is not from a declining industry or low growth occupation, and if the client was not long-term unemployed. The majority of dislocation jobs are from either a declining industry or low growth occupation, or both. Again, documentation for the barrier of required additional assistance to gain employment when you determine eligibility. It just states case notes. But again, it's important for you as the grantee staff to understand your case note would have to explain why the person could not go back to work in their previous industry or occupation when they were laid off. So to recap, for any client to meet dislocated worker eligibility criteria under unlikely to return, they must first be eligible to draw a monetary UI benefit or exhausted UI or meet their alternative to UI called tenure. Then the individual must also meet one or more of the following criteria. The dislocation job must be from a declining industry or a low growth occupation, or the client must have been unemployed for 26 weeks with 1 month of job search, and this is under long-term unemployed, or the client requires additional assistance, which must be justified by a case note as why the client was laid off from a job that was not declining industry or location and they cannot go back to that job or to another employer. So this wraps up the dislocated worker eligibility for unlikely to return to previous industry occupation. If you understand the ins and outs of unlikely to return, then the rest of WIOA dislocated worker eligibility should be really easy. The next topic of dislocated worker we're going to talk about is plant closure or substantial layoff. How this works is that an individual must have been terminated or laid off or has received a notice of termination or layoff from employment due to a permanent closure of or a substantial layoff at a plant or facility or enterprise, or is employed at a facility in which the employer has made a general announcement that the facility will close within 180 days. Within the apprenticeship application on the goals and current situation screen under employment, the question of, I lost my last job because of plant closure or large layoff. If that's checked, then the criteria for plant closure or substantial layoff is going to be met for eligibility. You'll notice that there's several documentation choices to support this. The layoff reason for the dislocation job at eligibility termination should then be populated with whichever is correct from the choices of plant closure, substantial layoff, or in the case of the businesses being within 180 days of closing in process of going out of business. Often there are questions about what is a substantial layoff or a large layoff. It could be tied to 50% of employees, but could be broadened depending on the situation. As an example, if a company was running 3 shifts but closed down an entire shift, that might only equal 1/3 of the employees, but that could easily be justified under substantial layoff. If you have questions about whether or not a client meets the criteria of substantial layoff, reach out to your supervisor or grant manager, and they can also reach out to me, or you could reach out to me. A big thing to understand, it doesn't have to be large companies neither. If you think about it, you could have small companies and maybe you have a sales staff of 4 and they let go 2 people. Well, that's 50% of a sales force. So that could be considered a substantial layoff. So again, it doesn't necessarily have to be large companies. So you have to look at each circumstance to determine if it's a substantial layoff. Something to understand about plant closure, substantial layoff, there is no additional criteria tied to UI status or tenure, nor is there any criteria tied to if the dislocation job is from a declining industry or a low growth occupation, or if the person was long-term unemployed, or if the individual requires additional assistance to regain employment. All that is part of criteria under unlikely return. For plant closure or substantial layoff, it's going to be tied to them getting laid off, either from a mass layoff or just a plant closing, and that would meet their eligibility as long as they met the general eligibility of authorized to work in the United States and compliant with selective service. So by far, one of the easiest ways to qualify a client is under the dislocated worker criteria of plant closure or substantial layoff, and it should be used anytime a client meets this criteria. The next one we're going to touch on is formerly self-employed but now unemployed. This is outlined in the Commerce Dislocated Worker Policy, and some of the details about it, it must be the individual's primary job. It can't be the secondary job, so I can't be DJ Jazzy Jim on the side and stop doing DJ business and still be working and then come in and try to become a formerly self-employed, now unemployed for my secondary job. Additionally, besides being the primary job, it also has to show that the job was closed either due to general economic conditions or a flood or natural disaster, or there's evidence of the business going out and failing. So it can't just be a matter of somebody no longer wants to do the work. It has to show why it closed, and again, it has to be either general economic conditions or flood or natural disaster, or proof that it's going out of business. Now, most people that own businesses, they're fighting tooth and nail to have this business be successful, and they don't want to close it. So typically, if somebody's going to come to us, it's because the general economic conditions or the disaster, or it's in the process of going out. On this, with the current situation, I could see a lot of small businesses running into issues where it's closing or on the way to close. So you might find this criteria is coming up quite often in this applications. It's within the apprenticeship application on the goals and current situation screen under employment. There's just a question. I owned a business, but now I am unemployed because of general economic conditions or natural disaster. If that's checked, that's going to correspond to the criteria of formerly self-employed, now unemployed. So if that question is checked, when the documentation is brought up, you'd have choices of self-attestation business records, bankruptcy documents, notice of foreclosures. So you'd have the records to support the status of either general economic conditions or flood or natural disaster. Which, by the way, just to touch again on this, the COVID could be considered the natural disaster on this. It's fully understandable that COVID has affected businesses, so that could definitely meet this criteria if the business closed due to COVID. The next one we're going to talk about is a displaced homemaker. It's again addressed in our commerce policy on dislocated worker. And for the definition for a displaced homemaker, it's an individual to meet the eligibility criteria of dislocated worker for displaced homemaker. They must have been providing unpaid services to family members and who has been dependent on the income of another family member but is no longer supported by that income and is unemployed or underemployed and experiencing difficulty in obtaining or upgrading employment. So this is the definition. If the client meets the criteria, then they would meet the dislocated worker unlike of displaced homemaker. One point to note, under the WIOA definition of displaced homemaker, there was an additional wording added to the definition of displaced homemaker where it speaks about folks, the dependent spouse of members of the armed forces. However, the wording is a bit awkward. It's a long paragraph. And then within the WIOA legislation, they created their own section of spouse of active duty service members. So myself, I would recommend utilizing the new WIOA dislocated worker criteria of spouse of active duty service member that we'll speak about in a moment if somebody is married to somebody in the military versus using the displaced homemaker for that criteria. Within the apprenticeship application, under the employment-related section, there's a question. I was supported by my spouse who is no longer supporting me. I am unemployed or underemployed. If that is checked or indicated, then the client's going to meet the criteria as a displaced homemaker. Let's talk about some of the possible individuals who might fall into this. Let's think about an individual who's maybe the spouse was the primary breadwinner and they got divorced, or the spouse was the primary breadwinner and the spouse passed away, or the primary breadwinner lost his or her job. Those are probably the three most known displaced homemaker criteria. So when you're looking for the documentation for those, you're going to be looking for documentation that supports those circumstances. So it could be layered depending on the circumstances. So at a minimum, the documentation is going to be showing the client's work history because it's going to have to show that the individual who's applying is either unemployed or underemployed. And then the next, it's going to be based on the situation. Are they divorced from the primary breadwinner? Is the primary breadwinner passed away? Did the primary breadwinner lose his or her job? So then your secondary documentation would be based on the circumstances. So below is if the question in the workNet, or excuse me, in the apprenticeship application is checked of I was supported by my spouse but no longer supporting me, and I am unemployed or underemployed, you have the choices that show up. But again, it's really important to note that you have to support the entire criteria. So in this case, you have things like signed and dated WIOA application. Well, it would have to indicate those circumstances, signed self-attestation of marital status. That could be one portion, but it still would have to support the entire, to show the client's work history as well as how he or she met the criteria. So the next one we're going to speak about is spouse of an active duty service member. Again, as I touched on, this is the newest criteria. It was not part of dislocated worker under the predecessor to WIOA, WIA. So it started, and it's really a good new category. I was in the Air Force for 20 years, and anytime you'd move every 3 to 4 years, it's tough on a spouse because they have to give up their job and move to follow. So they've created this criteria, and what it's set up for is if somebody's married to a member that's on active duty in the military, and they end up having to lose their job or give up their job to move and follow their active duty military spouse, they are eligible under this program. But even beyond that, if somebody is married to somebody that's in the military, if the spouse is just unemployed or underemployed and is experiencing difficulty in obtaining or upgrading employment, they're also eligible. Now, in the state of Illinois, we have a couple of large active duty military installations. Down in the St. Louis, Belleville area, we have Scott Air Force Base. And then up in the Waukegan area, Great Lakes Naval Center. So those are probably two of the largest active duty military. And then, but also any town that has, it's reasonably sized will have armed forces recruiting centers. So everybody that works there, if they have spouses that meet this criteria, they could be eligible. Larger colleges, universities, they have ROTC units that often have active duty military assigned there. So if they have spouses, they can meet this criteria. So again, these are just some ideas of places for outreach. How it works as far as the questions within the application, it's on the goals and current situation screen under employment. And there's a question, I am married to someone who is an active duty service member. If that question is checked, it opens up the two sub-questions, which I am unemployed or underemployed, and I lost my job due to my spouse transferring. If either of those secondary questions are also checked, then the client's going to be indicated as meeting the criteria of spouse of active duty service member under the dislocated worker title. To qualify as dislocated worker under spouse of active duty service member, again, when the spouse loses their job due to transfer or if they're just unemployed or underemployed. For the documentation for it, if either of those questions are checked, at a minimum, the documentation will include the military identification card showing the spouse of the active duty service member. And then if they lost employment due to the spouse being transferred, the transfer orders along with the client's work history. If the client was based if the eligibility was based on the spouse just being unemployed or underemployed and having difficulty obtaining or upgrading employment, then you'd get the client's military identification card showing the spouse of an active duty service member and the client's work history supporting unemployed, underemployed. Below are the current acceptable documentations that's listed in the application eligibility determination. You'll note that there's a change that's put in. So in the real near future, you should see spouse military identification card and work history, military transfer orders and work history. And the signed and dated wheel application will be taken out because you need more substantial documentation. So this concludes the various ways an individual could meet WIOA dislocated worker eligibility criteria. To recap, there are 5 different ways an individual could meet WIOA low-income eligibility, and each criteria is significantly different. If a client meets any one of those ways that we've laid out, they would meet dislocated worker and they would be eligible for services. And again, those are unlikely to return to previous industry or occupation, plant closure, substantial layoff, formerly self-employed, now unemployed, displaced homemaker, and spouse of a member of armed forces on active duty. So this concludes the presentation on WIOA dislocated worker eligibility. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me at james.potts@illinois.gov, or you can call me at 217-416-7097. Thanks and have a great day.